It's the week ending Saturday the 5th of December, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the UK government becoming the first in the world to approve the Pfizer COVID vaccine. 25,000 retail jobs at risk following the collapse of Arcadia and Debenhams, and F1 driver Romain Grosjean surviving an incredible crash with only minor injuries. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Gabriel Power and Joe Evans, and making his debut on the show, it is science writer for The Economist, Alok Jha. Hi, Alok.
Hello, Olly.
I imagine you've had a rather busy year. There's been some notable science to communicate.
Has there been something? I don't know. Has there been something going on this year that's science related? I don't know.
What is the one thing you've spent most of your time explaining?
Things like how testing works, what specificity means, what false negatives and false positives are, why, the fact that vaccines have come along really quickly. First of all, explaining that vaccines can't be done really quickly, then explaining why, even though they've been done quickly, they're still safe, all of those sorts of things. I try and stay away from the conspiracy theories about 5G and stuff, but generally there's quite a lot of other stuff to explain.
I asked the man for one thing. He comes up with 7. That shows you there's a lot going on in your mind.
It's been a busy year. I could carry on.
First up, it's Gabriel this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Trump sends his best boy to solve another diplomatic crisis in the Middle East.
Kushner will bring a delegation that includes former Iran envoy Brian Hook, Avi Berkowitz, who's been key to those Israel discussions, as well as Adam Bowler, who heads an investment company called DFC that's part of the government. Kushner will first head to Neom in Saudi Arabia before coming to Qatar.
Simone Foxman of Bloomberg News on Monday speaking about Jared Kushner's trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, or Qatar, as she put it. Gabriel, what's the plan?
So, the Trump administration's diplomat extraordinaire, Jared Kushner, who is also the son-in-law of the president and one of his senior advisors, is headed to the Middle East this week for extended talks with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and he will also visit Qatar, as she said, over the current state of play in the Gulf. So it looks like Donald Trump is seeking to kind of cement his legacy in the region, which has been a bit turbulent during his time in office. And the kind of jury is out on exactly what the aim of Kushner going to these countries is. So the reasons for the visit, they haven't been disclosed by the Trump administration, but a number of news outlets have cited sources claiming that Kushner has been sent as a kind of last-ditch effort to smooth relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who have been at loggerheads since 2017, when Saudi Arabia and its allies accused Qatar of state-sponsored terrorism, effectively.
Last-ditch attempt to smooth over relations between those countries, Gabriel, or actually a last-ditch attempt for the Trump administration to claim the credit? I mean, some people are saying things are heading in that direction anyway.
It's not necessarily that things are heading in that direction anyway. I think if left to their own devices, the two countries may actually continue to bicker because there didn't really seem to be much of a light at the end of the tunnel for the conflict. But what is really odd about this is the whole thing just poses more questions than it answers, which is if Trump is weeks away from leaving the White House, he's already kind of revealed that he's interested, or according to sources within the White House, that he's interested in doing some major poop stirring in the Middle East before he leaves. Like he asked his advisors if he could bomb Iran just after the election. So it's clear that he doesn't really have any interest in being the sort of purveyor of peace that he painted himself as a couple of months ago when he claimed to have brokered a deal between the UAE and Israel, which was a very kind of wishy-washy deal that didn't actually mean much in the end. So Trump's motives here are quite hard to read.
Joe, what is the situation at the moment between the Saudis and their allies and Qatar? Because depending which sources you look at online, and obviously Al Jazeera is run by the Qataris, you get very different ideas about how successfully this process of severed ties has been going.
Yeah, so as Gabe points out, since 2017, Saudi Arabia and its allies haven't been in contact with Qatar. This is loosely linked to a allegation that Qatar supports terror groups and also related to their relations with Iran. And obviously, the US has huge issues with Iran's backing for proxies in the region that commit acts of terror allegedly on their behalf. It's a long-stated goal of the Trump administration to sort of stabilize the Gulf. And I think that there is an argument that this is a sort of, victory lap in an attempt to sort of cement Trump's legacy in the Middle East. His national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, said earlier this month that resolving the Gulf crisis was a priority before they leave office. And I think it is fair to say that if they are able to fix the rift between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, it would bring a massive sense of stability to the region that's been missing. The difficulty, as Gabe points out, is that no one's quite sure what they're trying to reconcile necessarily. Axios have been told, for example, that they're trying to get a deal on several outstanding issues. Very unclear what those things are. And it's also very unclear what the US is looking to get out of it. So, for example, one of the things that has been suggested is that the US wants to use the talks in Saudi Arabia to cement an agreement for Saudi Arabia to allow flights from Israel to pass through their airspace, which seems like quite a small concession to be chasing in what is actually quite a kind of difficult and contentious negotiation. So the whole thing is kind of clouded slightly a mystery, which possibly just speaks to how unpredictable the Trump administration's foreign policy has been for 4 years, and it looks as if they're going to depart the Oval Office in sort of similar style.
Yeah, and Alok, obviously this is significant for people living in the region, and, it's interesting that it has been widely reported by Arab news outlets and Israeli news outlets and not really in the West. But even if it's successful, what does the US gain from peace in this region, actually?
Well, I mean, the idea of peace in the Middle East is not something that one administration can solve by itself, even though the Trumps and others have tried. What does it get out of peace? Well, I think that it's one of the most unstable regions in the world. So the idea that a nuclear armed power like Israel is safe is probably a good thing. The fact that Iran, which is another rapidly nuclearifying, if that's a word, power, is potentially kept in check is actually a very good thing for the world in general. If I can be a cynic here about what's going on, the foreign policy game of the United States has been sort of all over the place for the last few years. They've had a strange sort of fixation with the Middle East, which on the surface looks very normal for the Americans to do, because that's what the Americans do in a leadership role. But let's face it, the Trump administration has really pulled out of a lot of international agreements. It's pulled out of the JCPOA, the Iran agreement, which has meant that Iran has sort of intensified its intents to develop nuclear weapons. So all of this is actually making the region much more unstable. So these small cosmetic things right now with Qatar, yes, they're important, but they're not going to solve any of the problems that Jared Kushner or others are really, really interested in. I mean, if I can sort of float an idea, I mean, the thing is that the Trump administration is on its way out. So I'm not sure that any of this negotiating right now is going to make much of a difference when the Biden administration comes in. They've got a very clear plan for the Middle East. I wonder if this is just more, the guys going to the Middle East to shore up their own contacts, to think about what those guys are going to do in private life, in business. So I don't know. There could be some element of that going on too.
Which is interesting, isn't it, Gabe, when you think that, Trump's inauguration was all about America first. And actually, in the final month of his presidency, he spent the time challenging the legitimacy of the election and not really doing anything domestically. Whilst the only thing they are doing is about international stuff, knowing that Biden's going to come in and focus on domestic relations with coronavirus.
Yeah, so I feel like there's an element here of the Trump administration attempting to, as we've already discussed, cement a legacy in the Middle East. Now, that might be because obviously Trump has this great deep hatred of Obama and this horrible, very intense disdain of everything that he did. And so I feel like the fact that Obama came in on this message of hope and change and all that sort of stuff and promised that things would get better in the Middle East, and then in reality they didn't. I feel like Trump is now has suddenly realized, oh, whoops, my tenure is coming to an end. Maybe I need to be the isolationist guy that I said I would and sort things out in the Middle East. There's an argument to say that he is trying to shore up a sort of coalition of antagonism against Iran before Biden comes in. So Biden, as Alok said, wants to rejoin the Iran deal, the Iran agreement, which would lift sanctions on Iran in exchange for them keeping their uranium enrichment facilities at a very low capacity. And so the fact that last week Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated, potentially by Israel and the US working together, it indicates that it's more Trump shoring up antagonism against Iran in order for Biden's job to be harder when he comes in. That's my take.
And that's an interesting facet of this, isn't it, Joe? Because on the surface, it might look like the administration's actually somewhat softening their feelings towards Iran, because after all, what the results of this might be is the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and its allies in Iran. But actually, it seems like one of the things they're asking for is for Saudi Arabia to open its airspace to Qatari flights, which are currently paying millions of dollars to Iran to route over their country. So this would actually further punish Iran financially, wouldn't it, if they weren't getting the money from Qatar?
Yeah, and discernibly, it is a softening of tone towards Iran when you consider that a month ago, Trump was asking the vice president and various other senior advisors for nuclear sites to scope out for attack as the votes were still being counted in the US election. It's obviously a marked decrease in hostility. What Gabe says about building a coalition of antagonism against Iran, though, does seem to hold some weight when you consider that Kushner's relationship with Mohammed bin Salman is obviously very close and has been very important to the Trump administration in the last few months, but also the last few years generally. If you then consider the fact that his trip is coming not long after a secret meeting between Mohammed bin Salman and Netanyahu in Israel, it does sort of suggest that there is a sort of concerted effort to shore up this defensive base against Iranian, either expansion in the region or, as we've discussed, enrichment of uranium capacities. So I think it certainly is possible that there is an attempt to build up that sort of coalition, which would obviously make life incredibly difficult for Joe Biden, who has made very clear that he wants to revert back to a more traditional American foreign policy based on international alliances, and that alongside the European Union and alongside the kind of key players in the European Union like Angela Merkel in Germany and Emmanuel Macron in France, are very keen to start trying to breathe some life back into the Iran nuclear deal, and that an effort to antagonise Iran and build up a sort of defensive line in the region against them before Biden can even get into office and start operating in the official function of the president would obviously make his life slightly more difficult.
And Alok, the 4 other Arab nations made a list of demands for Qatar to meet before their embargo would be lifted, which included things like abandoning ties with Islamist organisations and shutting down Al Jazeera. Surely some of those demands have to be met, otherwise they're going to look weak.
You'd think so if this was a normal negotiation, but the issue is that the countries making those requests are also implicated in things that they want Qatar to stop doing in some way or another. No one is completely clean in this game, and a lot of it is positioning themselves for politics. And I think that the difficulty with trying to understand what's going on with the US foreign policy right now is that you're trying to assume that there is a plan and there is a strategy of some sort. And I just don't think that there is. I really don't. There's been no evidence of one in a strategic way so far. So the fact that in the last few weeks, in the twilight of an administration, when the president himself is completely absorbed by whether the election is real or not, him trying to do something real in the world just doesn't make sense. And I don't think we should try and find anything in it. And to be honest, it won't make a difference in a few weeks when the Biden administration comes in.
I think what Alok just said is very interesting because, as was pointed out earlier, Trump came into office with this America First mentality. And that was, he won election in 2016 on that mentality. It seems that the Trump administration's fixation with the Middle East has sort of come with the zealot of a convert, in that they don't seem to massively understand the region brilliantly well. And the fact that Jared Kushner has been their sort of point man in Saudi Arabia sort of lends credence to that argument, a man with absolutely no international diplomacy experience. And I think that makes Alok's point about trying to read it as if there is some sort of overarching foreign policy idea here very prudent, because, the reason that you say the zealot of a convert is because converts are often the people that understand the thing they're talking about with the least depth and grasp. And it does seem that has been the Trump administration's attitude towards the Middle East. They've decided to become very interested in it. Whether that's because of Obama's pivot away from the Middle East and the desire to directly fly in the face of Obamaism is perhaps a separate question. But with that very sudden pivot and sudden massive increase in interest since they won office has come a very basic lack of understanding of how the region functions, which may well be just what's playing out here in the last few months.
Okay, Joe, you are up next after this. Okay, Joe, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
How young is too young for gender transition?
when I first arrived at the clinic, my belief, that I was a boy or, that I should become a boy was affirmed. There was no investigation into why I had those feelings. It was pretty much accepted from the get-go, and, medical interventions were spoken of quite quickly.
So you went ahead, you had the blockers, you had surgery, and then you decided that wasn't the right course for you.
Yeah. Just realising, I think, that a lot of it isn't based in, it doesn't have scientific evidence behind it.
Kira Bell speaking to Emily Maitlis this week on BBC Newsnight. Joe, what's the story?
So in a landmark judgment this week, the High Court has ruled that children under 16 with gender dysphoria are very unlikely to be able to give informed consent to undergo treatment with puberty-blocking drugs. So puberty-blocking drugs are medicines which stop the body from developing, and they're normally given to children with gender dysmorphia, but they'll now only be able to be given to children if they are evidence to understand the treatment they're about to be given.
And that's a result of a case that involved that lady we were just hearing from, Kira Bell, who was born female, decided to transition to male when she was a teenager. That's why she still has a deep voice now, took the puberty blockers and everything, and then changed her mind.
That's quite right. So Kira Bell went to the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, which is the only NHS gender identity development service in the country, as a teenager, and was prescribed puberty blockers when she was 16. She later had a double mastectomy when she was 20, but is now detransitioning. And her argument in the court case was that the clinic essentially should have challenged her more over her decision to transition to male as a teenager. So the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust have said that it's obviously very disappointed by the decision, but has immediately suspended referrals for under 16s for puberty-blocking drugs. The implications of the case really are what the High Court judges specifically said, which is that it's highly unlikely, in their view, that a child under the age of 13 would be able to be competent enough to give consent for puberty blockers, and that it's doubtful, in their words, that a child aged 14 or 15 could understand and weigh the long-term risks and consequences of being given puberty blockers.
And Alok, what does that mean? Highly unlikely, doubtful, for the children who are now adults who did make that decision when they were 13, 14, 15 and don't regret it.
So I think a lot of it's still unclear, to be honest. The Tavistock Clinic won't be getting any referrals soon while this all shakes out. But what's interesting about the judgment is that there's some arguments to say that the evidence for puberty blockers, which the Tavistock Clinic says are a reversible set of hormone treatments, the evidence for them doesn't seem to be very well documented scientifically. Normally you would track people, work out what's happening and document it in the scientific literature, get people to do different types of trials, and then there'd be a consensus that would build amongst the scientific community about what's good about them, what's possibly negative about them, and then that would be used to inform treatment. And it seems from reading the judgment that data just hasn't really been collected. And so you want that data. Whether you're of the mind that this is something that should be available to children or not, that you need that data. That's the basis you should start from. And so I think that's if it means that scientists collect that data, that's a good thing. For people who are going through this treatment, I'm not sure that it would be a good idea to stop because of a court judgment. That this is something that's between a doctor and the child or adult in question. So we should park that discussion there. But it will do, I fear, is that it will suppress, for those people who want this sort of treatment and are going through the consultations and everything, it will suppress the experts and doctors' willingness and ability to give them that treatment. So that is definitely going to happen until we can get to the bottom of either the scientific debate on this, which might take a long time, or there could be appeals to the judgment as well to sort of allow these treatments to go through right now. Because at the moment, what this judgment kind of says is that rather than being an established treatment, this is experimental. It's an experimental treatment. And if you're doing an experimental medical treatment, the rules around it are totally different to something that's more established within the NHS. So I think that is a very important debate that that the medical community needs to have right now.
I mean, what it also does, Gabriel, is it sort of basically says that if a child is under the age of 16, then in the future it is possible to give them puberty blockers as a medical professional treating them. You just have to go to court to say that you want it. It's a reversal of what we have at the moment where you go to court to say it shouldn't have happened. So it's just another level of precaution, isn't it? Is that something that you can understand the need for? I mean, I appreciate this isn't gender reassignment surgery we're talking about here. This is just taking some drugs, but they're, very important, significant hormonal changes that happen as a result of taking them. And the court saying, on such a serious thing involving a child, if they're over 16, that's a different decision. That's something that you should come to the court to seek extra approval for.
See, I don't know, because I feel like, I don't know if it's the court's decision to make. Obviously, it's not really my place to have too strong an opinion on it because I'm a cis male. But a lot of the children and young people who are referred to the NHS Gender Identity Development Service can be on waiting lists for years. And, they can go through months or even more years of evaluation by psychologists and psychoanalysts. And if you are serious enough about transitioning to wait potentially years before subjecting yourself to traveling all the way to and from a clinic for a barrage of, really personal and uncomfortable questions like week in, week out for basically an indefinite period of time, I'd say you're probably pretty serious about transitioning. And there are statistics that back that up. So in 2017, there was a major study done based on patient reports from the NHS Adult Gender Identity Clinic, in which researchers examined the rate at which people who had transitioned had expressed a desire to detransition or expressed some amount of regret over their decision to transition. And of the 3,398 people who had appointments during this period, 16 of them expressed transition-related regret. That's 0.47%. It's a very, very small number of people.
But to be fair, Keira Bell doesn't say she's the majority, does she? Her point is, Joe, this happened to me. And the thing she was actually saying, if you listen to the interview, about what she felt would have stopped it happening to her was if she'd been challenged more about it. I wonder if there was a middle ground there, ensure that there is a more challenging process rather than involving the courts.
Yeah, so the reason that this is incredibly difficult is because what Keira Bell is really asking for, or what she argued for in court, is actually an extension of pre-existing medical protocol. The crux of this basically rests on a concept called Gillick competence, which is based on a ruling from the 1980s of a child called Victoria Gillick, and the court decided that as a child she could not consent to medical treatment. Essentially what is now being ruled by the court is that same level of oversight and checking for competence hasn't been applied to gender dysphoric children at the Tavistock Trust, and that it should be applied in future. And specifically what they did, they've laid out 8 points within which there's examples such as including the fact that the vast majority of children that are put on puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones, which are irreversible, and the understanding that, for example, cross-sex hormones may lead to a loss of fertility and sexual function. So what they're essentially saying is that the scrutiny that has to be applied to other types of medical procedure haven't been applied, in this case, to children at the Tavistock Trust, which actually, when you look at the numbers, is quite a large number of people. We know that in the last financial year, around 2,700 young people, again, as Alex says, the data isn't particularly brilliant that the Tavistock has collected, so knowing exactly what that means is quite tricky, were referred to the clinic, and that around 40 to 50% of those go on to medically transition. So what the court has essentially said is that it's a significant number of people that are being able to transition without applying pre-existing medical protocol in terms of testing their competency to make decisions about what treatment they receive.
And on that issue, Alok, about giving consent when you're 16, and kind of widely understood definition that as you enter adulthood, you're going to be able to give consent more fully than a child. The difficulty here is it is significantly harder to transition if you've been through puberty, isn't it? So it's sort of rock and a hard place. You can't really wait until a child gets to 16 to make the decision because they've already hormonally become the gender they don't want to be.
So it's a very tricky thing to work out when it is that that sort of responsibility sort of arises in a person to be able to sort of determine their own sexual identity. And what some of the sort of responses to this have been interesting. No one is suggesting that people at the Tavistock Clinic or medics who have to deal with these sorts of issues are just willy-nilly giving drugs out, and that actually it's easy for a child in their teens to transition without sort of the knowledge that they've been given. I don't think anyone's suggesting that, but there is one bit of it, which is that which sort of campaigners sort of in support of Keira Bell are sort of arguing, which is that when a child of maybe 12, 13, 14 wants to transition or is thinking about those sorts of issues, that instead of directly giving them an affirmative path towards it, which is what maybe some people are concerned about, perhaps there could be a bit more of an exploration of other issues that they may be going through to get to that point in their decision making. Of course, it could be that they want to transition, and that's something that can be discovered through psychotherapy and other medical professionals can help people through that to work out what they want to do with them and with themselves. But there could be other issues involved, and I think that. That some campaigners are arguing that perhaps those things should be explored a bit more, so that you're not just going from, you're not just medicalising the issue straight away, that there is a bit more of a sort of a discussion. Now, I do appreciate that it's not at all easy. It takes many, many months, years to go through these processes, even at places like the Tavistock. But, without knowing myself or what the exact procedure is, it feels like perhaps there is a sort of a middle road between saying absolutely not, you're not going to be transitioning, and also this more complicated life-changing decision that could be explored.
Also, I mean, the thing you were saying earlier, Alok, about, the science, to use the phrase that's been very in vogue this year, still yet to have the rigour applied to it that you might like. The courts have actually ruled on the issue of consent, not on the science. They've sort of used the science as the excuse, haven't they? They've said the science is as yet innovative and experimental, but it's a ruling on the consent. So regardless of how rigorous the science becomes, until the High Court come up with another ruling, anyone under the age of 16 is going to have to go through this process now. Yeah,
right now, in this moment, you're going to need a court order to get the clinics to sort of actually move forward if you want to be gender reassigned or transition. The scientific evidence question is interesting, because what the High Court seem to have said is that in the years that these clinics have been operating, they've just not collected data well enough to allow a scientific evidence base to build. And without going through the papers and the data myself, it's hard to know how true that is. But let's take the court on face value. Let's assume that they have looked at these things and they've said that actually the scientific evidence base hasn't built. If you've not got the scientific evidence base, it's hard to explain that evidence base to anyone, never mind a 12 or 13-year-old. I'm sure there are plenty of younger people who, if taken through these issues and the evidence and the pros and cons carefully over a long period of time, they would understand what's happening to them and would have a good chance of it, at least with sympathetic adults and everything. So, but if you've not got the evidence in the first place, what can you really tell somebody?
And actually mentioning the sort of sympathetic adults is important, Joe, as well, isn't it? Because I think in some of the kind of polarised social media response to this kind of story, you sense that people will assume that the parents aren't involved. You can only have treatment as a child for this if your parents already are involved and have given their consent. So there is family support for all of these individuals.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I think one of the reasons that has come out as such a key point in this is that one of the claimants in this case is the unnamed mother of a 15-year-old girl with autism who is awaiting treatment at the clinic. And so I think that this suggestion of sort of sympathetic parents has been drawn out because of that woman's involvement in the case. I think the issue here is that, and a very key point to make, and that campaigners against the ruling have made, is that this is going to make it more difficult for those children who suffer incredible discomfort due to gender dysmorphia to get the type of treatment that they need. It's also got very wide implications internationally, because it's not just in the UK that we're having this discussion. It's a very hot topic in places like Canada and the US and Australia. And actually, if you look at Australia, they've taken completely the opposite decision to the decision that the High Court has made here. The family court in Australia has said it should not rule on puberty blocking treatment. This isn't a case for the courts. And actually, there are two states in Australia, the Australian Capital Territory and Queensland, who have even said that the psychiatrists can't give therapy to transgender children, because they've compared that to conversion therapy and said that in doing that, you're trying to change a trans person and make them not a trans person. The important thing here, and I think one of the key things that should be taken from this, is that obviously more data is needed, and it's going to be very difficult to make decisions on this until more data is available. As Alok rightly says, this is an incredibly loaded scientific debate, and that you can only make judgments on those things when the data is collected accurately and in large enough numbers. In the short term, the Tavistock has requested permission to appeal the High Court decision, so we'll have to wait and see how that appeal plays out. But I think there probably is a point to be made for the fact that the debate around these issues could do with becoming a hell of a lot less toxic, because I think that the debate is so incredibly aggressive, that it does risk turning children and children suffering from gender dysmorphia into pawns in the culture war. And I think that that's very unlikely to benefit anybody.
But briefly on this, and finally, Gabriel, a positive to be taken from the fact that the discussion is happening in the mainstream media at all is that it's happening, right? I mean, if you think back 20 years, for trans people, there was no mainstream media discussion really of their situation at all. And maybe, I mean, this show's all about looking forwards, isn't it? Maybe we're at a blip at the moment where the debate is a bit crude and unsophisticated, indeed termed as a debate sometimes when there isn't one. But at least it's being had.
I don't know. I feel like there's been, with the rise of the alt-right and the, intellectual dark web or whatever they call themselves and those sorts of people, you do have a lot of people online who are expressing very harmful and negative opinions about trans people and trans identity and all that sort of stuff. And I feel like if the steps we've taken since, say, the 1980s or the 1990s in terms of recognizing trans people has led us to this point where the High Court of this country is blocking access to care and restricting the bodily autonomy of an already very marginalized group, then I feel like maybe that's not a situation that you would necessarily view as progress.
All right. A change of story next. Alok, you're coming up after this. Okay, Alok, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the end for the world's most famous telescope?
A huge telescope at the iconic Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico has collapsed. This comes after officials announced the radio telescope made famous in the James Bond film GoldenEye was set to close after it was damaged last month. Officials made the announcement after key cables broke. They said even if they could repair it, the structure would be unstable long term. This radio telescope, built in the 60s, was the second largest in the world. It withstood hurricanes and earthquakes while playing a key role in many astronomical discoveries.
CBS News basically giving you the whole story there. A big telescope has broken. Alok, why should we care?
So the Arecibo telescope is something that, even if you don't know anything about astronomy or astrophysics, you've probably seen it. And it's enormous. It's beautiful. It was in GoldenEye, the James Bond film. There's a scene of a very long chase sequence, and I think even a Wilhelm scream as someone's jumped off one end of it. Basically, it's a massive telescope. It's a receiver dish that sits 300 meters across in a natural depression, a sinkhole in the forests of Puerto Rico, and it was built about 60 years ago. And it was an icon because it did so many important things. It was built initially to spy for intercontinental ballistic missiles. So because it's a radio receiver, it could analyze the ionosphere, which is this sort of charged particle space up in the atmosphere, and it could hunt out missiles on their way to the United States.
Okay, and like in very basic terms, how did it do that? So it's a radio telescope, but like literally, what did it do? And also, like presumably, there are smaller instruments to do that these days, 50 years later.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So what it did was, as well as receiving radio signals from space, and it could detect them, it had a radar. So it could send radio signals up into the air and reflect off places like the ionosphere and work out what was in there, basically. But for scientific purposes, what it did was much, much more interesting than just looking for ballistic missiles. It sort of sat there and just received radio signals from space, and like the radio waves come from all parts of space all the time. So from stars, from galaxies, from black holes, everywhere. They're just appearing from all over the place, and it's a way of sort of probing the furthest reaches of the universe. And because the Arecibo was so big, it was very, very sensitive. And so amongst the scientific discoveries it found pairs of spinning neutron stars. Neutron stars are the sort of end state of very, very heavy stars. When they explode at the end of their lives, they leave these weird objects called neutron stars behind, which sort of send radio signals out, and you can detect them. It also detected one of the first planets around in another solar system. So nowadays we know there are thousands of planets sort of orbiting other stars in different parts of the galaxy. But back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we didn't know that.
Okay, but I mean, you're talking entirely in the past tense. Was it doing any of this stuff now? Like, what's its relevance these days? Because this isn't just an obituary, is it? This was a thing that presumably was still functioning and now isn't. Is it needed?
There are instruments around the world that are much, much more sophisticated and sensitive than Arecibo. But don't underestimate how important this thing was culturally. Not many people know about the various instruments, scientific instruments that are out there doing all these amazing things. Arecibo was one of the first, and it starred in films, and it really was something that inspired huge rafts of astrophysicists and other scientists to actually get interested in this stuff in the first place.
Did it inspire you?
So I've known about Arecibo since I was a kid, because it was so massive and it's so beautiful. It was in this forest. It was almost like a film set from the beginning.
That's what I'm picking up, Gabriel. I don't know about you. I'm asking about its scientific importance, and all of the enthusiasm is coming out of this, basically. It's this huge thing in Puerto Rico. It was in a film. Do you think that's important? Do you think inspiring the next generation of scientists, Gabriel, is actually as important as doing the science?
Absolutely. So a lot of people have come out on Twitter, particularly this week, to say that they got their start at Arecibo, or that they know people who were inspired by it, and how a lot of Puerto Ricans ended up working in astronomy. And so it definitely has some cultural importance among the people of Puerto Rico. And also it also stands as a kind of cultural monument to US underfunding, because it's been sat there for years in need of a repair. And unfortunately, it's been kind of left behind. But it did. One of the reasons it was, a repair was needed is because it did actually serve a pretty important function until recently, until it collapsed. Because it partially collapsed earlier this year, and then it fully collapsed this week. And that was that among its planetary tools, as Alok was saying, was planetary radar. And that's a pretty unusual capability that can give scientists a much better look at near-Earth objects and can trace the trajectory of asteroids. And so it was quite a handy tool in tracking asteroids to see if they were on a collision course with Earth. And now the only remaining radar transmitter of that type is at the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Center in California, and is 20 times less sensitive than Arecibo. So our capabilities at tracking asteroids now is slightly worse than it was, even though there is now a giant telescope that's even bigger than Arecibo that's been built in China called the 500-meter aperture spherical telescope. But that doesn't have quite the same capabilities. It's still also being ramped up, so it's not quite there yet. So there is a bit of a gap in our knowledge for now that we need to refill.
There you go, Ollie. Asteroids. Do you want to be hit by asteroids?
I think at some points of this year, people would have actually been quite up for getting hit by asteroids.
I mean, Joe, do you think that, bearing in mind everything that Alok and Gabriel have said, therefore, it really was underfunded and more money should have been put into it, partly through a kind of science nostalgia? I mean, we're trying to look at repercussions for all of us here, and I'm thinking about the International Space Station, which is set to be decommissioned, isn't it? And there's been attempts to see if the private sector would like to preserve that. That's a similar thing, isn't it, in the imagination of the world, the International Space Station. But if it's superseded by better technology, you can understand why people put their millions elsewhere.
I mean, yes, you can, but I mean, if you kind of listen to Alok's passion about it, it'd be hard to argue that you shouldn't fund these things better, right? Like it was quite moving watching sort of scientists and even some sort of Puerto Ricans that just live near the telescopes, literally tearing up in interviews talking about this thing. I mean, it was run through the University of Central Florida, and underfunded universities is nothing new necessarily. But I do think there's something to be said for the fact that, as you say, like the International Space Station, which I think has also appeared in a James Bond film, there's a theme emerging here. Things like these scientific monuments, which are recognised by people even not in the field, I think there is an argument for keeping these things funded and keeping them intact, simply because if they do inspire the next generation of scientists. And I'd heard of this telescope, and I'm one of the least scientifically literate people you could hope to meet. And I think that if I've heard of it and I'm kind of saddened by its demise, then I think that, the next generation of young scientists will be even sadder. And that is, that's obviously not good for the world of science, and it's not good in terms of inspiring the next generation.
All right. Alok, a final elegy.
Well, so as amongst the many real scientific discoveries that Arecibo has helped with, and the films it starred in, one of the things that it did one of the first things it did as well was to sort of beam messages into space, and so Arecibo was used in 1974 to send a message into space, a beam of messages to a globular cluster, a galaxy about 25,000 light years away. So it's and this was just things like the atomic numbers of hydrogen and carbon, a diagram of what humans look like, the number of people on Earth, etc. A bit like the golden record in Voyager in the late 70s. And this was beamed out, and it's like 47 light years away from Earth now. And so some alien species, if it exists and interacts with this 1,000-bit message, they'll get some information about humans. It was a bit of a cosmetic exercise, but it shows that actually this thing in its later life, one of the other things it was used for was to detect messages from alien species. It was used for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which is why it ended up in the film Contact. It was looking for radio signals from space, which is actually a field of science that now is very, very well funded and researched. There are loads of telescopes looking for biosignatures and other things from other parts of space, and the science of looking for life elsewhere. I wouldn't say was started by people at Arecibo, but certainly helped along. And it's a very, very cutting edge, interesting science where we really will find out the answer to whether there's life elsewhere in the next 20 or 30 years. And then telescopes like Arecibo are the ones that sort of got people onto this road.
It's quite a concerning thought to think about alien species stumbling across this podcast transmission and trying to deduce anything about human life from it. But that is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to our own stellar constellation, Alok, Joe and Gabriel. We will be back next Friday. You can subscribe for free via your podcast app of choice. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.